David served as Saul's cupbearer for much of his youth and adolescence. And certainly as much as Saul was a tremendous, Saul was a very tall man. And so in as much as Saul, I'm trying to adjust this, sorry to adjust this camera a bit. But as much as Saul was incredibly gifted, he was known to be fast. He was known to be very strong. Saul may have been as much as a head taller than your average Israelite. I think Saul also suffered from a great deal of insecurity. He had come from the tribe of Benjamin, which was the lowliest and poorest of the 12 tribes. And his family was kind of the poorest of the whole tribe of Benjamin. So, despite his stature, despite his strength and his speed, Saul did not have a very bright future until Samuel said, "You've been chosen to be the king." And that makes sense. Coming from the poorest of the poor, that God would lift him up. I mean, that's consistent with the message of Christ, right? That we're going to bring up the poor. But Saul wasn't able to handle that. David has this relationship with Jonathan. Let me back up before we get to that. David's relationship with Saul is compounded in that he's married to Saul's daughter. David marries Saul's daughter, and so he knows Saul as king, but closer than that, Saul almost becomes like a surrogate father in some ways. He is certainly David's father-in-law, and he's his best friend's dad. And so, the thing, though, that David never loses sight of, in spite of all Saul's attempts to kill him and these fits of rage, I mean, it's quite, I'm not a psychologist, but Saul was probably at least manic depressive, if not bipolar. I mean, he just goes into these fits of rage where he will just out of nowhere get mad and throw spears at people in the royal court. And David would often be playing his harp or whatever to try to entertain the king, and the king would just get mad at him and throw spears while he was playing the harp. Despite all this craziness, David believes not so much in Saul. David believes in God, and he believes in the nation of Israel. And he believes that the king of Israel has been appointed by God for a reason. And if God anointed Saul as the king of Israel, then God has him there for a purpose, and it's nobody's place to remove him from that throne except God. David's relationship to Jonathan is equally complex, mainly because of his relationship with Saul. Jonathan has every selfish reason, and not just selfishness, just his self-interest. I mean, Jonathan is lined up to be the next king of Israel. And his biggest competition is this farm boy named David. And David happens to be his best friend. David and Jonathan both are incredibly gifted athletes. They are incredibly strong men, and they are incredibly capable soldiers and warriors. There is story after story. David and Jonathan, I don't know who to compare them to, maybe in American history. I mean, kind of like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett. I mean, these guys were tough outdoors guys. Jonathan with a bow could not be equaled. There was a time when David was on the run from Saul and he needs a sword. And so he goes to a synagogue, a temple in the north, and gets Goliath's sword. And you can imagine how big that sword would have been to have accommodated a 9-foot man. And David wields that thing. Presumably, for Goliath, it would have been a one-handed sword because he carried, of course, a shield and a spear that he used. David would have probably had to carry it on his back just for the length of it and would have probably wielded it with 2 hands. But the idea that he could wield it and did wield it very effectively gives you an idea of the strength and skill that David had as a warrior. These guys were brothers. They're kind of the Lone Ranger and Tonto of ancient Israel. And they truly, truly cared for one another. I mentioned my own brother earlier. And of course, I'm very blessed that we are close. I talk to him a couple times a week. We're very close. And I'm glad, and he is my best friend, but he is also my brother. It's not often that one is able to find a friend who isn't blood and to have that kind of relationship with them like family. Oftentimes it takes something like combat, something like going to war together, some kind of a shared strife that forges those kinds of brotherly bonds. The Greeks would call it philia, or brotherly love, like Philadelphia, of course, is the city of brotherly love. I mentioned in a previous message about my friend John Brooks. Brooks and I went through ROTC together. I think of John, I call him just Brooks, and he just calls me Box because that's how it is in the Army. But Brooks I think of as family. The other friend I mentioned, Sean Nickel. Nickel was 2 years ahead of us, and he was our Ranger Challenge company commander, team leader in college. Nickel used to yell at me for all I was worth, but he also was an excellent cadet and went on to be a very fine officer, airborne ranger, served at the 82nd. Both of those men went on to do, they're real soldiers, combat vets both. But, I think of Nickel like family. And I have a good friend who I served as a chaplain with at Fort Bragg, Sean Dennis. I don't get to see Dennis very often. But Dennis and I went through chaplain school together and served at Bragg together. I think of Dennis like family. He's like a brother. And combat and shared strife like that forges bonds in those ways. The other thing that I think forges bonds is faith. Because as much as I do love men like Brooks and Nickel and Dennis, I also consider some of the friends that I know through church to be like family. Men like my great friend Jay Knight or Matthew Clark, men that I knew in the Wesley Foundation in college who had nothing to do with ROTC. In fact, I don't know that Matthew Clark, he could have never kept the hours of the Army. He's a night owl, When I first met him, I thought he was just a hippie, But those men, through our shared faith, those men are my brothers. And Jay married a lovely woman, kind of a childhood friend of his named Jana. And Jana has become like a sister to me. Faith can forge family. And that's, I think, true for David and Jonathan. They had both of those factors. They fought together, and they both loved God and did the best to serve Israel together. And they had a tremendous respect for the king, but they had a deeper, deeper desire to serve God. I say all this today because I was reminded of David's pain, that when he has to hear about his friend dying, how hard that would have been. Like when Jesus heard that Lazarus had died. But David cannot raise Jonathan from the dead. And I know that many of you in our church family are terribly, we're all sad to hear that Mr. Fred Campbell has passed, because we loved him. And I know that that sadness is even deeper and compounded by the fact that you can't come to the funeral, and we're going to have to delay the memorial service for several months. It's sad when our loved ones pass, and it makes it harder when we can't be there to grieve together, to be with the family. It's harder. I think the Bible records stories like this, like the story of David and Jonathan and of Jesus and Lazarus, that to remind us that God understands very well pain, not just the grief of losing someone, but the added grief of being separated from them and from your other loved ones, and having to go through grief apart from the people you want to grieve with. That's very difficult. I am blessed because I get to preside over the funeral, and as difficult as it will be to talk about my friend Fred Campbell, I'm honored that I get to be with Miss Shirley and Brenda and Cheryl and the rest of them, to hug them, to see them, to pray with them, and to grieve with them. But I think David today gives us an example that his brotherhood with Jonathan was made, forged by faith and a sense of duty. And in the 7 years that I've had the privilege of knowing Fred Campbell, I would say he exemplified those two great ideals of faith and duty. You all remember he wore his little Marine pin and his American flag often. He's a man who loved this church. He's a man who served and supported this church faithfully. He was a friend to me, and he was a friend to everyone. He served his country as a United States Marine and worked 40 years on that railroad. That's a man whose life is defined by faith, duty, hard work. A man who loved his family, helped his friends, served his community, and faithfully supported this church. Fred Campbell loved Jesus, and by loving Jesus well, he loved all of us and turned his friends into a church family. I'll miss my friend Fred, and I know all of you do too. But know that even though we're separated now, and in this time of grief we can't all be together, God sees that. He sees us in our separation. But we are united in spirit and held together by our hope and faith in Jesus Christ. I love all of you. I know God loves each one of you. I know God is reaching out through the power of the Spirit to comfort the Campbell family and all of us in the Cameron family. Pray for the Campbells this week, and as you may feel discouraged and alone in this time of isolation and of grief, please know that you are not alone, that God understands how you feel, and that He is with you, even in this most difficult time. And remember that we are in the season of Easter, and that ultimately, those who have faithfully departed, the dead, are not lost to us. For Christ has defeated death, and one day we will be together, the communion of saints, as we feast at His heavenly kingdom.